Hello and welcome. I'm Suzanne Goldberg, Executive Vice President for University Life at Columbia University, and so glad you are all here with us for this University Life Forum, Reflections on the 2020 Elections and the Road Ahead. These past weeks have been extraordinary in American history. Americans have voted in record numbers, both before and on Election Day. Many of us in the United States and around the world have logged a very large number of hours watching television results or refreshing our favorite media website to see what's happening, both for the presidential race and for House and Senate races and other state races as well. All of this is happening at the same time as coronavirus infections are raging in the United States. An escalating number of Americans is struggling financially with the range of economic challenges that we are facing, and our society continues to wrestle intensively with issues of social and racial injustice, including anti-Black racism. Whatever your political affiliation, and whether you are a supporter of President Trump, Vice President-elect, or neither, we have a lot to think about. What brought us to this point of such national contention? What does it mean to be a United States when our nation is so fractured? And where do we go from here? We are so fortunate to have a fantastic group of Columbia faculty and senior leaders to talk us through these issues and shed light on what we know is a still developing situation. I'll introduce them in a moment. First, a word about university life. Our focus, as you know, is on university-wide community at Columbia, bringing us together to talk about pressing issues like the ones we're here to discuss today. We are also a hub for university-wide student life information, resources, events, and initiatives, including all sorts of ways for students to connect across the university to get to know each other. You can stay fully up to date on events like this and so much more, and great student voices, videos, and blogs by following Columbia University Life on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and for students in your weekly University Life emails on what's happening around Columbia. So turning now to our program, I want to thank everybody who submitted questions in advance. There are many, many of you here with us. We're really delighted. If you have questions during the discussion, please just submit them through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screens if you're on Zoom. If you are watching on University Life's website on our live stream, you can send us your questions by email at universitylife@columbia.edu. This event is being recorded and will be posted on Columbia University Life's website shortly. Now I'm pleased to introduce our panelists, and I'm going to do this very briefly. So after the event, I encourage you to look them up and see so much more of what they've done than I'll be able to describe here. We have with us Steve Coll, who's the Dean of Columbia's Journalism School and the Henry Luce Professor of Journalism. He's also a staff writer at The New Yorker, where he has written about politics, national security, the media, and much more. Dean Coll is the author of 8 nonfiction books and is a 2-time Pulitzer Prize winner. Between 1985 and 2005, he was a reporter, foreign correspondent, and senior editor at the Washington Post, and served as the Post's managing editor between 1998 and 2004. Jamal Greene is the Dwight Professor of Law at Columbia Law School and a constitutional law expert. He teaches and writes about constitutional law, the law of the political process, the First Amendment, and federal courts. He's the author of what sounds like a fantastic forthcoming book, How Rights Went Wrong, Why Our Obsession with Rights is Tearing America Apart, and numerous law review articles on the Supreme Court, constitutional adjudication, and constitutional theories of originalism. Professor Greene clerked for Justice John Paul Stevens on the US Supreme Court. Gillian Metzger is the Harlan Fiske Stone Professor of Constitutional Law at Columbia Law School and co-director of the Center for Constitutional Governance. She is a leading administrative and constitutional law scholar who writes and teaches administrative law, constitutional law, and federal courts with an emphasis on federalism and privatization. Professor Metzger is also a prolific writer and has co-authored numerous amicus briefs in major constitutional and administrative law challenges before the Supreme Court and other courts. She clerked for US Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Maria Victoria Murillo is Professor of Political Science and International and Public Affairs and Director of the Institute for Latin American Studies. She is the author and co-author of many, many books. So I encourage you to take a look at her website, including relevant to our discussion today, Non-Policy Politics, Richer Voters, Poorer Voters, and the Diversification of Electoral Strategies, and the forthcoming Understanding Weak Institutions, Lessons from Latin America. Her research on distributive politics in Latin America has covered many topics, including most recently electoral behavior, contentious dynamics, and the analysis of institutional weakness. Finally, although Professor Yamil Velez is not able to join us as originally planned, we are very fortunate to have Shailagh Murray. Shailagh is the Executive Vice President for Public Affairs at Columbia, overseeing our Office of Communications and Public Affairs and our Office of Government and Community Affairs. She spent nearly 6 years shaping communication strategy inside the Obama White House, and before that was Vice President Biden's Deputy Chief of Staff and Communications Director. Shailagh spent the first part of her career as a journalist with the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. And now let's turn to the discussion. We'll spend about 45 minutes in conversation as a group and then turn to your questions, and we will try to take as many as we can. And know that even this part of the conversation is informed by questions you've already submitted. So where are we? We're just after the election results were announced on Saturday, November 7th, 4 days after Election Day. Many people celebrated the outcome and many others were disappointed and distressed. That's pretty typical for presidential elections, but there's arguably a lot right now that is not so typical. Donald Trump and many key agency heads and Republican leaders have not recognized Joe Biden as president-elect. Many national and international leaders called to congratulate Joe Biden, but others, notably from Russia and China, have not. Joe Biden, as president-elect, is moving ahead with the transition, which is constitutionally set to take place on January 20th, 10 weeks from today. So we have a lot to sort out here about the results themselves, in addition to understanding more about voter engagement, voter suppression, political polarization, and what happens between now and Inauguration Day. We'll get to all of this. Let's start with where we are now. And Dean Coll, I'd like to start with you, because many of us look to the media to let us know who won, right? Well before the election results are officially certified, and certainly before the Electoral College has its vote. So can you just talk with us about how an election gets called and how confident we can be in the media's calling of an election in these circumstances or any others?
Well, I think the Associated Press, which is one of the major news organizations that's been calling elections for a long time, has been doing so since the middle of the 19th century. So the media's role in attempting to project results that aren't officially certified has been part of the landscape of elections, certainly in the post-war period and in the television era, a critical part of how Americans have experienced elections. What actually happens is that news organizations, the AP and the major networks, prepare for an election by building a decision desk that is made up of journalists with experience at covering presidential elections, as well as political scientists, data analysts. They access the same data that everyone can see being reported at the state and precinct level as it comes out, but they have some ways to get that data to flow in, and they model it and project it out. They're not always right. I remember vividly sitting in the newsroom of the Washington Post in the wee hours after Election Day in 2000, helping to make a decision to pull back a headline that was on the press saying Bush had won, and frantically trying to remember my college statistics to figure out what the outstanding vote in Miami-Dade and Broward meant for Gore's chances. We finally decided we didn't know enough to call it, and so we said nothing, which is sometimes the right choice in this role. But in that election in 2000, NBC, AP, and others made mistakes and tried to learn from them. What happened this time around was that the major networks and AP prepared as they normally do. The AP made a big statement in advance of the election that they were going to take this very seriously. They recognized there were a lot of differences in this vote with late mail ballots and other issues. But they called the elections as they saw them, basically, off of the same decision desk. And the last thing I note, as I'm sure many of you noted who were watching on election night or paying attention to the news cycle around it, you know, Fox News, which has a reputation of being aligned with the White House and the Republican Party and doesn't always march to the same drummer as the other major television networks, has a reputation for having a very serious and a straight up decision desk. And they performed that way on election night. It was Fox News and AP were the only ones who called Arizona before 2 in the morning. And as of this moment, as far as I'm aware, they're still the only two that have called Arizona. So there's a little bit of art and a big pretension of science, but it is a professional operation and has been around for a long time.
Thank you. And just one quick follow-up. So at this point, AP, all the major networks have called the election for Joe Biden. Is there any reason to doubt the integrity of those calls or the solidity of those calls, do you think?
No, I mean, I don't think so. I do think the Arizona call is still, you know, something to watch what the final numbers are. But AP called the election because they called Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. In Wisconsin's case, the vote was heavily in. There wasn't a lot of vote outstanding. In Michigan's case, the margin was more than 100,000 votes for President-elect Biden over President Trump. And in Pennsylvania, they waited until that Saturday morning where the mail vote count pushed President-elect Biden far enough ahead that the AP and all the other networks simultaneously decided there was just no other outcome possible from the outstanding vote. And so that's why we have the call we have. There are still a couple of states, Georgia being one of them, that the AP hasn't called yet because it's in automatic recount territory. And so the expectation is that they'll let the recount go forward until they make a final determination, just as the state of Georgia will do.
And interestingly, even getting ready for today's conversation, who knows what the newest headline is, but it seems that there's a recount by hand. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. But now let me turn to Professor Gillian Metzger to give us another angle on where we are right now. So there's a lot of litigation out there, or at least it appears from the headlines that there are a lot of lawsuits or threatened lawsuits challenging the election results. Can you talk to us about those and what you think what are the issues there and what are the likely outcomes? You may be muted, Gillian. Thank you.
Sorry. I mean, this election has marked an all-time high in terms of the overall amount of litigation that it has triggered. There have been hundreds of lawsuits before the election, and now obviously we're in the after the election part. There have been numerous lawsuits filed in all of the states that have been sort of on the margin or ones that were thought as where the litigation might change the result. Most of those are lawsuits that have already been dismissed, or courts have gotten rid of them, largely because the allegations that are made in them weren't supported by evidence, or the claims of how whatever was claimed in the lawsuit would have actually affected the result wasn't really clear. And there's sort of, many of them seem pretty thin, according to the assessment of experts in terms of what they were alleging. There are some states that have seen repeated suits. There's one recent additional suit now in Michigan, which has a lot of affidavits, although again, the actual evidence is not clear that it's all that supportable. There is litigation in Pennsylvania, recent lawsuits challenging some inconsistencies. There have been a lot of suits challenging keeping the observers at bay, in their view. Obviously, all of this is complicated by COVID. Some of the complaints have been that observers have been kept 6 feet or more away. Being closer than 6 feet obviously would raise some concerns in terms of COVID protocol. So no doubt that is playing a role, and they're also limiting the number of people who could get into spaces. So all of that has led to a lot of litigation. I don't think this litigation has yet shown that it's going to affect the results. The states are going ahead with counting and with certifying, as far as I can tell. There is the recount that's going to happen in Georgia, but Georgia was within the range for a recount. There was the Trump campaign had said they were going to seek a recount in Wisconsin. I don't know if they've actually gone ahead and done that. For the vote differences that are in these states, I mean, Wisconsin, I think, is over 20,000. Michigan, Steve mentioned this right now, I think it's like 150,000. Pennsylvania is 50,000. Arizona is 15,000. And then Georgia is closest at 12,000. Nevada is 37,000. That's incredibly hard to overcome anything like that with a recount. Recounts really are more likely to switch, a few hundred votes here or there. So it really doesn't seem to me likely the recounts are going to make a difference. And I don't see yet in this litigation any real evidence. It really seems like it's kind of a throw everything at the wall or at the courts and see what will stick without any real basis. And I think some courts are appropriately getting rid of the lawsuits pretty quickly.
So thanks. So it sounds like, before this election, the President Trump had said, this election may wind up in the U.S. Supreme Court, and it sounds like you're saying that you don't see any of these cases winding up in the U.S. Supreme Court, at least from what you know right now.
But not from what I've seen. I mean, there is this one recent one filed in Pennsylvania that might be interesting to keep an eye on. The litigation that got up to the Supreme Court before really turned on efforts to extend deadlines for receipts of mail-in ballots, for example. That's the suit that came out of Pennsylvania. And it basically framed up one of the main constitutional questions that we saw back in 2000 with Bush versus Gore about what's the meaning of state legislature. The state legislature in the Constitution is given power to select electors, the method of choosing electors. And what does that mean? And that's a constitutional question. And that was the question that they were trying to get before the Supreme Court at that point. A lot of what we're seeing in terms of evidence or fraud or claims, many of these suits are being dismissed by state courts. They're being dismissed by federal trial courts and appellate courts. I haven't seen one that really tees up a legal question that would be of the kind of magnitude yet that it really seems to me that it would have such an impact on the election that the Supreme Court would intervene. But we have to wait and see.
So thanks so much. So Professor Greene, let me turn to you with a different angle on the questions of how solid are the election results that have been announced. There's been conversation about faithless electors. There's the question about what does the Electoral College do? And I think for many people who have read the definition of the Electoral College or the project of the Electoral College many times, I think a lot of people still don't really even understand what the Electoral College is and does, and whether the electors, whoever they are, can vote in a different way from their state. Can you talk us through that a bit, and feel free, of course, to add any comments you'd like on the litigation related to the results?
Sure. So first of all, I completely agree with what Gillian has said about the likelihood of any of the current litigation to either get to the Supreme Court or to affect the outcome of the election. I haven't seen any evidence or claims that would be likely to either be interesting to the Supreme Court or certainly to affect the election result. On the Electoral College and or other means of achieving a result that seems different from what people have voted for in individual states, I think the bottom line is that that's extremely unlikely. So that's the first point to make. But given the political environment and the general unpredictability of the times we are in, it's not surprising that people have brought up the possibility either that electors might make a different choice from what the voters of particular states have voted for, or that state legislatures might intervene in some way to direct their electors to do something along those lines. Both of those are quite unlikely. On the first point, the Electoral College, one of the odd things about our system, of course, is that we don't elect the president directly, but the president is elected by electors, and we elect the electors through processes that are established by the laws of individual states. And with some exceptions around the margins, generally speaking, states award their electors to the winner of the popular, or the party that wins the popular vote within the state. But the Constitution contemplates that the electors themselves, who are individual party loyalists generally, are the ones who do the voting. And that voting will happen on December 14th. And there have been times in American history, including in the last election in 2016, in which electors have not voted for the person who the party, who's the candidate of the particular party for whom they are electors. So they do have the power to do that in some states, and some other states have said that they can't do that. There was some litigation last year about whether states are permitted to bind their electors to the winner of the popular vote in their state. And the Supreme Court said that they did have that power. So there are some states where they're bound to vote for the winner of the popular vote in the state, and others where they're not. In any event, these people are generally speaking loyalists of their political parties. It is very rare for them to vote in a way that's different from the way their party wants them to vote. And in any event, if current leads hold, Biden will be ahead by 36 electoral votes, which is way too many for it to be plausible that a so-called faithless elector would affect the election result. So that's not very likely to happen. There are other possibilities that have been kicked around in provocations of various kinds, that state legislatures might step in and direct that their electors vote for the slate of for the candidate of a different party than won the election. I see this also as quite unlikely. Whether they have the power to do that is pretty murky legally and probably not worth getting into, but it would lead to significant litigation if it happened. It would also lead to significant unrest, and I think possibly violence if a state were to try to do that. And there's been no indication that any state legislatures have an appetite for doing such a thing in an election that is not especially close, right? So I don't expect that to happen. It would be legally dubious if it were to happen, and so I think we more or less should expect that on December 14th, the Electoral College will vote for Joe Biden, and he'll officially become president-elect.
So it's all very interesting and very helpful. Thank you. I mean, part of the point that I take from you, in addition to the particulars about the Electoral College, is that there's a lot out there on social media and in mainstream media, tossing up many different ideas, many different concerns, many different questions. But at the end of the day, from what you're saying, it sounds like this is, absent something extraordinary, the vote that was announced in the way that Dean Coll just described is likely to proceed through to the Electoral College and through to the inauguration of Joe Biden. So, Shailagh, let me turn to you. You're a veteran reporter, spent a lot of time on Capitol Hill, you know the political world. Can you talk to us about what it means that President Trump has not conceded the election, that the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has not recognized Vice President or President-elect Joe Biden? How do you see this, the feel on Capitol Hill, to the extent you know, and what this conversation or these decisions not to concede and not to congratulate President-elect Joe Biden by Republican leadership and by including leaders in the administration mean for where we are now?
Sure. I think it's important to separate some of the peculiarities of this particular election from Trump's behavior, because I think it's an important distinction for people to understand. What made this election hard to call and had it drag on for days is the fact that people were voting by mail in vast numbers that they had never we'd never seen before in states that often had almost no mail-in ballot provisions even 4 years ago. So it was hard to understand voting patterns in the way that decision desks usually understand them. It was, you see places like Arizona and Georgia, which have just never demonstrated the kind of voter turnout that we now see across the board through virtually all sectors of the voting population. And the great news is that turnout was up in both parties, so it really helps, I think, make the case long-term for instituting a much more permissive voting approach to voting that will ultimately turn out more people. But the downside of that is it takes longer to call these elections. It takes longer to, some of these states were restricted from opening ballots before Election Day. That's why these key states took so long to count. And so I think it's important for people to understand that there's infrastructure issues here that we need to just understand, and that Trump has taken advantage of that confusion to sow doubt about some of these processes that, in fact, he is responsible for, like the late counts in states like Pennsylvania. So, but I also think then you have what we're seeing unfold now is this sort of dramatic stages of grief that look like every other experience that we share with Donald Trump, where everything is just bigger and more amplified. And I think that he's letting this play out, or it's playing out. I don't ascribe any I don't know exactly what he has in mind, but I think people are just, right now it feels like they're just letting the process sort of unfold. And the thing that we can all feel very confident about is that to the extent you believe in a deep state, the most important and effective role of the deep state is the continuity of government, and it is deeply entrenched in our system of democracy. And there is just no question that the loser of this election will leave power, and the new president will come in. I mean, so I think that you saw a very, very large demonstration of support for Trumpism, and voters registered their displeasure with the president himself, but you can certainly conclude from the election results up and down the ballot that they don't have as big of a problem with some of his policies, and certainly the approach to governing that Republicans have demonstrated over the last, really 12 years. So we are living in that system, right? And that system will live on, and it shouldn't surprise anyone. And I'm sure it doesn't surprise Joe Biden to see Republicans react the way they are, because their approach was just validated. Just as their leader lost, their approach was validated by all of these wins and Senate races that were somewhat surprising, and state legislatures that they managed to hold on to that we thought might go Democratic. So it's very much of a split decision if you look at the entirety of the result, and they certainly are acting. They believe they received a mandate as well for the approach that they've taken, and you really can't argue with that based on the results.
Thanks so much. And you've raised two important issues that we will come back to. One about sort of what do elections next time look like? Do we, have we learned from this one like we've learned from past ones, and what we put in place, and also how to think about all of this in the context of deeply different competing and popular worldviews. Before we go to those questions, Professor Murillo, I'd like to turn to you. You're our comparativist in the room today. And we've also seen an absence of congratulations from some national leaders, as I mentioned before, China and Russia. When I last looked, Mexico, Brazil, and North Korea, and some others, and an influx of congratulations from others. A lot of the world was watching this election, as usually happens, and I've certainly, and I'm sure many of you have seen photos from election night photos, American election night photos from around the world. So what, looking at where we are in a comparative lens, what is this kind of mixed congratulations, absence of recognition, tell you about the state of where we are post-election?
Thanks. I think, everybody's really been pretty strategic. I mean, the whole world has been watching at this election. I mean, this has been a significant and probably the most significant election in many years for most of the world. And you see many of the traditional allies of the United States that Donald Trump had, not get along with, like in Europe, immediately congratulating Biden. Some of the countries like Israel that have a clear policy for the United States also immediately congratulating President-elect Biden. And then I think Russia and China are special actors here. They have a lot to win from the fact that the US democracy does not work as well as it should, and they have invested in that. So I think their cautious is to be expected. It's interesting in the case of leaders whose countries are more dependent on the United States, like Mexico or Brazil, that they really take such a clear stance. And I think there might be something that we are also observing in the Republican leadership, which is fear of the consequences. Donald Trump is still in power and still the president until January 20th. And they might, they have two different consequences for them on policy, in particular for the case of Mexico, which, is so affected by any US policy. And in the case of Bolsonaro in Brazil, you see something very similar to what you're seeing in the case of Republicans. He's afraid of the consequence on his own followers. He is playing the Brazilian Donald Trump, and you see it in the Republicans that are not congratulating President-elect Biden because they're afraid that then Trump would not support them in races. The Georgia election is clearly one of them. And so I think in both cases, it's a similar behavior as Donald Trump has a lot of power, both as president and more importantly, in terms of the popular support that he holds. And his influence, is even beyond the United States. He has become a symbol of a particular way of doing politics. So I think that has granted him a significant amount of power that is even hard to understand, goes beyond the traditional way of thinking about US foreign influence. And I think the other point that I want to make from a comparative perspective is that the US is the last country in the world with an electoral college. And so that had really puzzled the rest of the world, the fact that the winner, in the last 8 elections, the Democrats won 7 of them, the Republican won in the re-election of Bush. But the fact that winning the election doesn't mean you're the president, it's odd for presidential systems. We take it for granted in the United States, but has been abandoned by other countries that has it. And so that's also made the election of the United States very puzzling and hard to understand for the rest of the world. This idea that the institutions are so dissociated from the preferences of voters. And not to mention the other difference that is that each state decides its electoral system, even for a federal election. That's also something that's very puzzling for the rest of the world. And so it has some curiosity on the legitimacy of the election. And I'm wondering, I mean, we don't know in the long run, we will know in the future, what are the consequences of this particular reaction, not only of the fact in the 2000 election, the number of voters that thought that the election had not been fair was the largest in recent elections in the United States. But what would be the consequence in the legitimacy of the democracy, given not just this association between the Electoral College and the popular vote, but all that has transpired in terms of calling for the legitimacy of voting?
So thank you. You've given us even more to think about as we kind of contemplate both where we are now and what this ought to look like in the future, with this thread through of what does it mean to have a legitimate election in the eyes of voters, in the eyes of others outside of the United States. So let me turn back to everybody with, we're going to insert like sort of a lightning round question and then go back to a sort of a more extended question about polarization and what did segmentation of voting look like in this election. But I guess the lightning round question that follows for me from this discussion is, what do you think could or should change when we imagine the election 4 years from now? Whether it's what media are doing, or should we have digital voting? And that's always a millennial favorite, right? We should be able to vote on our apps. Is the Electoral College with us forever? Are we learning any lessons from litigation that we ought to take account of? So I'm going to turn it back to each of you, and I'll just note one other thing first, which is that in addition to the nuts and bolts of the ways elections work in the United States, I think there's a mythology that we have election day and all is decided on election day, when in fact it's kind of a 3-month process, right? November is election day, or this year it was October and November. December is when the Electoral College votes. Inauguration doesn't happen until January. So it's actually a quarter of the year. Not to mention the 2 years of campaign that we've had beforehand. So it really seems like, another version of this question is, are we ever not in an election process? But Dean Coll, let me go back to you first on this lightning round version. Either what might you want to see or imagine we will see differently, either in the media or in the ways people are voting?
I think the ways people are voting is probably the easier one to take. Shailagh started on it, but convenience voting, as it's sometimes called, had been growing even before the pandemic. In 2016, 40% of votes were cast before Election Day, either by early in-person voting or by various forms of mail voting. There are 5 states, including very red Utah, that have essentially an all vote by mail system. So this has been growing for 20 years. The pandemic accelerated it. Shailagh mentioned that there were some states this time around, like Pennsylvania, that weren't prepared for the surge in mail ballots, and that is absolutely true, and we're still seeing it. And yet it was Pennsylvania before the pandemic in 2018 that for the first time enacted a law with a Republican-controlled legislature creating no excuse absentee balloting, essentially mail balloting at will. So I do think that let's hope that we have a vaccine and we return to normal by 2024, that this march of convenience voting in different forms should and will continue. And to your point about adjusting our experience of election results and our expectations on election day, election night, that certainly began in extraordinary circumstances this year. But it's very normal in some large democracies around the world to have elections spread out over weeks. I mean, I lived in India for a few years, and their national elections, which are not untroubled, but are, pretty sound considering the national infrastructure, they take place by design. The voting takes place over a couple of months, and then the results are all consolidated and announced. So there's many different ways to have a credible election. And I do think for lots of reasons, moving to multiple forms of voting is my hope for, if not prediction, about the next election.
Right, Shailagh, just since you were on the Hill and voters and thinking about all of this, and you brought this up to us, can you pop in on the lightning round next?
Sure. I think this period voting is where we're headed, where we have several weeks of in-person voting and or mail voting. I think that digital voting is problematic for a whole lot of reasons, and but I do think that in-person voting with a lot more flexibility, again, because both sides would seem to benefit from that. I think we're headed in that direction, which is really great. I also think the other thing we're going to see more of, and it'll be interesting to see in what forms, is this like deeply invasive organizing that does seem to be working in certain areas like Georgia, for instance, through Stacey Abrams' efforts. I think that there's definitely a sense in the Democratic Party, and I've covered or participated in every presidential election since 2000, that the party's apparatus is just no longer effective in these, it's too candidate focused and too media focused, and not, doesn't have the organizing capacity that it needs. Not only, everyone knew it was lacking, the infrastructure was lacking, but now we see what the alternative looks like, and detached from the Obama machine, that it can be super effective when deployed at the ground level, even in states like Georgia that were, thought to be sort of a cycle or two away from being within reach for Democrats. So, Republicans have been at this game for a while, but I do think that the way to resolve some of the tensions within the Democratic Party now are potentially exist within this space where you build capacity for candidates of all stripes to compete effectively at very local levels. So there's lots of interesting takeaways here if you just kind of blot out the Trump sun.
And one of the points here too is that elections do take place at all levels, right? At the very local, to the national, and to the federal, and those look different in some places, right? And as we see, even in the primaries, some jurisdictions still have caucuses, right? They collect their views in a different way than even the traditional ballot casting. Okay, so Vicki, let me turn quickly to you. Lightning thoughts from the comparative perspective, and then Jamal and Gillian, I have a particular.
Yeah, I totally agree with the idea of easing vote. I think that's unique of the United States, that it's so hard to register and often so hard to vote because it's on a weekday. And so the turnout compared to other advanced democracies, in many cases, is relatively lower. But and there's also quite a lot of variation across state based on those regulations. So Minnesota normally has a very high turnout, and most of what used to be the Deep South tend to have lower turnout. And of course, that it's also affected by how competitive is the election. But I think to the extent to which we would move towards more homogeneity in having, not only a period of voting, but also the same rules, so that, a citizen in Tennessee has pretty much the same ability to vote as a citizen in Minnesota. I think that could be a fantastic, way to go, and one that would put the US in line with many advanced democracies. And I certainly share with Shailagh this idea that I mean, there's by now a lot of work that the local level, and especially giving more substance to the party. I mean, the parties have become pretty detached from the local organizing, in particular the Democratic Party. I think the Republican Party came back to build that. I think that's another lesson that's important, and the fact that not only people turn out in incredible numbers, but also was so energized, either against or in favor of their candidate. I think that probably gives the opportunity of everybody who had spent time doing phone banking or, participating in the election to be tied to the electoral process, and maybe to have parties that are more responsive to voters because they're more connected intimately to voters beyond just asking for money, which is what normally they do in every election.
You make a great point, and one of the really interesting things here is there's a lot of questions swirling out in various pockets of the nation about, is voting meaningful? Should we trust the process? And at the same time, we've seen more voting than ever before. So there's some push pull. I'll just offer personal experience, which is both 4 years ago and this year. I logged a bunch of hours on the nonpartisan election protection hotline to help voters around the country figure out if they're registered or how to vote or what kind of ID they need, and as well as to take in questions and concerns about polling places that aren't working properly. And it's quite extraordinary to have to look at the 50 state materials that one needs to do. So if you get a question from somebody in Florida and you get the same question from someone in Arizona or Alaska, your answer to that question is likely to be different. And it will involve going to multiple websites and digging into very complicated places. So certainly for the election protection hotline volunteers, more uniformity might be a desirable thing. So let me turn to, I think I heard Professor Metzger jump in. So I'll go to you and then Professor Greene. And the two particular, again, kind of lightning round angles, I would appreciate your saying something about, or have we learned any lessons from this about this cycle about voter suppression? And will we have the Electoral College in 4 years, or at least with the level of influence it has now?
Yeah, well, I just want to jump in just because I think I'm a little bit less optimistic than the tenor was earlier. I mean, I think there's some very nice things in terms of the degree of participation, the extent of organizing, the move towards vote by mail and other systems and convenience voting. That all is positive. But I also think we've seen the vote and the right to vote become deeply ideological, and the parties having very clear agendas, with some seeing expanding the right to vote as in their particular political interests, and the other side seeing suppressing it. And a lot of the lawsuits and litigation we've seen have been suppressive efforts, and efforts in the middle of a pandemic to make it much more difficult to vote, and efforts to make it more difficult to vote that have really not played out equally across all voters. And many of the rules for absentee ballots, for example, if you look at the number of ballots that have been disqualified from particular groups, it is not equal across all groups. There are many more percentage-wise from African American or minority voters. So I see those as actually real concerns, and to it, particularly with I mean, there's been in the House the HR 1 to try and really expand and protect voting rights, but without a pretty strong Democratic majority in the Senate to get that through, I think that's less likely, and I think that makes federal action to secure sort of uniformity and protect the vote less likely. And so I'm not sure that within 4 years we will see necessarily those protections, but I am particularly troubled by this identification of suppressing the vote so prominently as a particular political tool.
Thanks so much, Professor Greene. Over to you.
I unfortunately share Professor Metzger's pessimism about the possibility of federal reform in the next 4 years. The first bill that, she mentioned the first bill that the House passed in 2019 was a bill that would, among other things, create automatic voter registration, end felony disenfranchisement, and enact gerrymandering reform, which I think is quite significant, both at the legislative level, of course, but also in trying to take at least some baby steps away from significant congressional polarization, which is generated in part by the fact that people, that the only competitive election people have is their primary elections. On voter suppression, the Republican Party until quite recently was under a court order that prevented them from engaging in certain kinds of voter suppression tactics. That was lifted recently. And as Professor Metzger says, it has become a part of the political agenda of the party to make sure that fewer people vote, at least fewer people who are unlikely to vote for, or who they deem unlikely to vote for the party. On the Electoral College, it will be here in 4 years. It will be here in 40 years, I suspect. And that's not because it works particularly well, but because it's just so very hard to change it. The constitutional amendment would be able to change it, but that would require 38 states and 2/3 of both houses of Congress. And in our current polarized environment, that's very unlikely. And it's also not in the interest of swing states, which get more attention in a system where you have an electoral college. There is an effort to create what's referred to as a multi-state compact, where a number of states constituting 270 electoral votes, or a majority of the Electoral College, would pledge their electors to the winner of the national popular vote. So that's a kind of hack of the Electoral College. I think that's also quite unlikely because there are about 190 states, 190 electoral votes worth of states that have signed up for it so far, but the last 80 is a doozy because getting the states that are more likely to be competitive to sign up is difficult. It's also very hard to enforce and to keep enforcing it. So I think we have the system that we have now, and we'll have it for a long time. And then the question becomes, can you get more people to the polls or make it easier to vote in the ways that we've already talked about?
It's both sobering on the one hand that we may just be in for a repeat of these challenges, and then inspiring on the other that, you know, maybe there are some steps at least so that we can continue to grow, continue to change, and take advantage of some lessons learned. I guess we will keep studying and seeing, and I'm sure there's a lot more history to be written between now and then. So as we turn into this Q&A portion, I want to divide our conversation into two large topics. First, looking at questions of polarization, looking at who voted, who didn't, what is the segmentation by race, by sex, by ethnicity, urban, rural, and segmentation around views related to COVID, related to racial injustice and protests, and related to the economy. So that's one cluster of questions that I'm about to toss over your way. And then we'll turn to the set of questions about, so what really happens politically between now and Inauguration Day? What are the powers of the president? What are the powers of Congress? What are the powers of Vice President-elect Biden, if President-elect Biden? And what does it look like to you, even looking a bit ahead? So let's start with the voter participation questions. And Shailagh, maybe we'll start with you this time. You know, there's a lot of data on which populations voted in which ways. There have been, you know, many articles about the Hispanic vote, the Latinx vote. What does that look like? Were the Democrats surprised? There have been a number of articles too, really about virtually every racial, ethnic group, about how white women voted in even higher numbers this time for President Trump than in the last election, urban-rural divide, and again on the issues, protest, COVID, economy. Can you help walk us through some of that as you see it? And then Dean Coll, I'll turn to you, and then Professor Murillo.
I think that, well, there's a lot to unpack there, and I don't think we have a lot of great data just yet on the breakdown here, but I do think that it's really important that we not allow our kind of the Donald Trump and everything he personally represents to we don't confuse that with people who voted for him and why they voted for him. And I think, one example I saw, over the last few days was the, very surprising, I guess to a lot of people, outcome along the Texas-Mexico border and the bright red counties, and how is it that Hispanic voters in those counties who strongly opposed the wall that is the centerpiece of Donald Trump's presidency voted for him? And the answer, apparently, according to whatever exit polls or whatever, was they like those stimulus checks that he sent out over the summer. So I think that if you don't have a person in your life who you care about, who who you grew up with, who you have a lot in common with, but you don't know who they voted for, then you're probably living in a bubble, because a lot of people just they don't project as much onto their vote as other people do. And a lot of people vote their economic interests first and foremost. And the reality is a lot of people benefited economically during the Trump presidency, and they correlate that with him and his policies. And so I think you see these, whether it's higher than expected Black support for Donald Trump, or Hispanic, or whatever category of people you think shouldn't have voted for him. I think it's important to have some humility in terms of what people want and expect out of the political process. And, for a lot of people, it's very practical. And the answer to that question is very practical. So I think that Democrats, weren't really running on a policy agenda in the traditional sense that we've seen in previous elections. I think that it's harder to sell making Obamacare better than it is creating a healthcare option that everybody can buy into, which was the debate in 2008. I think that once Trump as a president is in the rearview mirror, we will, I think, be able to assess probably more objectively some of the policy or decisions that he made that people, kind of stuck with people, that may be surprising. And I don't know, I always look at these things as like the ultimate form of, it's like we all just consume all this, like these takes on everything, and then the voters speak and we're like, wow, that's so surprising. But it's just, that's what's the beauty of it, right? And we need to listen and absorb and then adjust, right? I mean, if you have skin in the game. So that's, I don't know, that's kind of a non-answer, but I don't really feel like there's enough material to work with right now to really dig into, like, why did this happen? Let's not forget that Joe Biden won the election handily by modern standards, and that election probably would have been called Tuesday night had all the votes been opened, when the polls closed. So that's the.
You make a very important point, of course, that some people are single issue voters. Some people are the proverbial who would I like to have a beer with voters. Some people are on the policies. Some people are on their bank accounts. I mean, we can see the early data, and it's hard to know. A lot of variability. There are interesting questions. Of course, these Black women are at least reported to have voted overwhelmingly Democratic, and questions about, well, what does that mean for the party and its responsibility? as compared to most other groups. But Dean Coll, let me ask you a question that maybe builds on Shailagh's response. We've talked in the past about purple states, right? States where there's really a mix, or even counties where there's just a mix of people voting in different directions. How does that play in, and what are your thoughts on the voter segmentation that we've at least seen at this moment?
Well, I think the thing that struck me on election night and a couple of days afterwards, looking at the Electoral College map, was how little had changed since 2016. Yes, the Biden campaign flipped what were pretty thin margins in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. With the exception of Michigan, which they won handily. I mean, they flipped Wisconsin with a margin slightly thinner than Trump won it by in 2016. And you look at that map and you say, what changed in the country during this extraordinarily divisive and unusual presidency? What seemed mostly to have changed was that feeling on both sides of the divide intensified and froze in place and grew. Which was expressed in high turnout in both sides. It was also expressed in polling errors because pollsters had very difficult time modeling this electorate, as it turned out. And mostly they had trouble modeling Trump voters again for the second time in a row. You know why? That's a much bigger subject, but when you don't see states remaining purple for very long anymore. Colorado was a purple state, now it's solidly blue. New Mexico was a purple state, now it's blue. Nevada is contested, but pretty consistent. The two big interesting cases on the map this year were Arizona and Georgia. I think the turnout story in Georgia was clearly the difference there, and definitely earlier than a lot of people thought it would come into play. In Arizona, very interesting to learn about. I totally agree that from my experience in past elections, the information you have about voter segmentation right after an election is often very poor. It's misleading. It requires scrutiny and time because the only data sources we have are exit polls. There's only two big ones because when you vote, you don't identify yourself in all of the segmented ways that people are interested in learning about retrospectively. And these exit poll consortiums have a mixed record of accuracy. So their data really needs to be correlated and connected to other kinds of research. It takes a couple of years, I think, to really get a clear picture of what happens in the ways that you're asking about. Yeah, you get some top line introductory data, but you don't get the whole picture. I think the country has been sorting itself into like-minded communities, both physically and ideologically for a long time. If you read that piece of journalism stroke sociology called The Big Sort that came out some time ago, one of the statistics that sticks in my mind from it is that the number of landslide counties in the United States, that is counties where the presidential victor wins by 20 points or more cycle after cycle, is more than doubled since the mid-60s. And it's on both sides. People are just sorting themselves into like communities, and you see that reflected in cyberspace. A lot of people want to say that cyberspace has accelerated or even caused that, but I think it's even more complicated than that. It is the way the country looks politically right now at a very high level of intensity because of Trump. And I don't really see how that fever breaks. If an external shock like the pandemic doesn't break the fever, as it were, the political fever, I'm not sure what in the next 4 years would do so. I do think that when a president like Trump leaves the scene, his power dissipates a lot faster than he thinks right now. And so it is possible that he'll leave some space for a Republican Party to emerge with a different kind of electoral strategy. But boy, he sure has left a very tempting target for populists, no matter how much his own personal power may diminish.
Let me unmute here. Sorry about that. You raise very important questions, of course, for the nation. And I also want to point out for our university community, right? the capacity and the desire to talk across difference, to really hear different viewpoints and engage with them and listen and share, a little bit like Shailagh was also talking about before, is incredibly valuable, right? We thrive in an academic community on the exchange of ideas and the contestation of ideas. And I think an interesting question for all of us is, what can we take, if anything, from this setting and how we do this here out into other parts of the world? But we'll just note that. And Professor Murillo, I want to turn it to you for your reaction to all of this from your comparativist perspective. And then Professors Greene and Metzger, I'm going to turn to you next on questions about, so, okay, what happens between now and Inauguration Day as a legal matter? But Professor Murillo, let me turn to you.
Yes. So again, from a comparative perspective, economic vote, it's super, it's how most people vote. I mean, in advanced democracies, the fact that people vote on their economic interest is never, it's commonsensical almost for political scientists. And if you think of before the pandemic hits the United States, if we were like right after the impeachment, Trump was, President Trump was, had a very strong economy, very low unemployment. He was the sitting incumbent. His probabilities of victory were relatively sound. And so, in fact, he has certain right to be annoyed by the fact that the pandemic came and changed the game for him. So I think that should be said. And the fact that a lot of people also emphasize the economy. I mean, the pandemic had two effects: the effect on health, that, it's pretty clear, but it also has a dramatic economic effect. So the fact that a lot of people use those lenses to understand the effect of the pandemic is not unique to the United States. It's really happening all around the world. So I guess these patterns of polarization or of understanding are certainly not unique to the United States. Things that are more unique to the United States that has to the prior conversation of voter suppression are issues like race. So what happened this summer with the protests that emerged after the death of George Floyd? That's more unique to the United States. The fact that even if you're an African-American voter, even one that benefited economically from Donald Trump, that you're a conservative voter. I think a large number of still you might be afraid of racism and do not vote your policy preferences or your economic preferences, but vote on race. That I think has to do with the history of this country. And in fact, I think Steve is right. Most of the exit polls are not to be trusted, but it seems that voters that care about racial equality were more likely to vote for President-elect Biden. Now, the other issue that I really want to put on the table is to what extent Donald Trump changed the Republican Party, or is he just a symptom of a longer phenomena and a longer road of the Republican Party? Maybe at least, when I arrived to this country, shortly after there was the 1994 election that Newt Gingrich, led with a very populist Coll. So I think the Republican Party had for a long time now built this populist discourse that is based on race, is based on social values, and is also based on the fact that some people have been left behind. The fact that, white and, non-college educated voters, men and women, were more likely to vote for Donald Trump tell us something about, how these voters feel in this economy and how they feel about the Democratic Party. They feel that the Democratic Party has been colonized by people like us. We are of different colors, we speak of different accents, and more importantly, we're educated and do not respect them. And I think that's, a feeling that, and the fact that this is segregated regionally of the sorting. But I think there's also the fact that the Democratic Party, especially since the 1990s, has embraced an agenda that they feel they were left behind, and has not been able, although certainly the campaign of President-elect Biden has tried to do it. He's replaced, I'm a boy from Scranton, Pennsylvania, I'm a working class person. But I think there is really where the Republicans see a future. And Donald Trump did it very well, but he was not the first one, in my view.
You know, thanks so much for that assessment. And it's interesting, and I meant to ask, maybe we'll come back to this in the very final comments, is, you know, this question of are we moving to a multi-party system, but so locked into a two-party system that we're just in this moment of kind of adolescent struggle from a sort of political organization. Yeah.
Susanna, a political scientist would tell you that the single member district would not allow a multi-party system to emerge. So it'd be hard. It's hard to overcome the single member district.
Thank you very much. This is the beauty of having a political scientist with us today. I appreciate that. So Professor Greene and then Professor Metzger, my questions for you are about the power of the president and the Congress in this period that is often called a lame duck period, which is just really refers to the period in which a new party or leader is slated to take office, but isn't there yet. There are lots of questions that have come up, right? What does national security look like in this moment? We know that Donald Trump is making a number of changes in his leadership of key national security and other agencies that work on national security issues, and other agencies as well. What does it look like there? Are there any limits to what the president and the Congress can do in this period? And another line of questions that has also come up is about the president's ability to pardon himself, and which has been talked about, and there's been discussion about, well, will the president pardon everybody in his administration? Can you, Professor Greene, first give us some insight into whichever of these you'd like to pick up, and then turn the rest over to Professor Metzger?
Sure. So I can start on the powers of the president. The U.S., for better or worse, only has one president, and that continues after the election and until Inauguration Day. So the powers of the president don't diminish in any way. This is maybe a pathology that we have insofar as, you know, if you fired someone who had a lot of power, you would, you know, you'd walk them to the door pretty soon after you fired them. But we don't do that for the president. And a president who's on his way out can do lots of mischief, including not participating with or cooperating in the transition to the next president, which involves discussing policy shifts, exchanging documents, giving access to office space and secured facilities, doing background checks on people who are going to come into office. So, or engaging in various forms of mischief in foreign policy or national security, all of which are on the table. And given that the president has recently gone through some major personnel changes at the Pentagon, and seems like might be about to do some other changes, that seems like a real possibility here. So there's not much one can do about that. There is a federal law that says that at some point the General Services Administration is supposed to cooperate with the incoming president-elect, but the current administrator of the General Services Administration has refused to do that so far. I think there's a decent chance that changes a little bit once the Electoral College is met and there's a true president-elect, but we don't know. And I'll leave the rest to Professor Metzger.
Thanks, Jamal. So yeah, I mean, so I completely agree. I mean, Jamal's absolutely right. We have only one president, and that president has the powers of the presidency, which are very, very significant. One of the things there's a phenomenon known as midnight regulation, where presidents in this lame duck session push through a whole bunch of regulatory options on their agenda that they didn't get to. It's a well-established practice that one of the first things that the new administration does is a stop order on January 20th to stop all regulatory actions that are still in the works. But there's a lot that can be put through between now and then. When Trump assumed office, one of the things, because he also had control of the House and the Senate, the Republicans were able to invoke something called the Congressional Review Act and invalidate a number of late-breaking Obama administration regulations. Both Republicans and Democrats do this midnight regulation thing, to be clear. But they were able to invalidate a number of significant rules using the Congressional Review Act. Another side effect of the fact that the Democrats may not have the Senate is that they will not be able to do that. So make it harder for them to get rid of a lot of the regulations that may come through if they don't have the Senate. I do think that right now it's a question like, a little bit of delay before the transition assistance and authority goes through is one thing. If it really drags on, it really creates a lot of barriers for the new administration starting up running when it does take office. It has issues in terms of security clearances. I mean, there's just so much that's going on that would be a problem if the transition didn't fairly soon start to have access. They've got the agency review teams available to go into agencies. A lot of the people on the Biden teams are very experienced hands and were in the Obama administration. And so they may know there may be some basis for communication, but as long as the Trump administration is really imposing a no talk, no cooperation policy, it's going to be hard for career staff in the agencies, I think, to do that transition that they are the bulk of achieving. On the pardon issue, so the pardon is a very significant power of the president, one that most people think cannot be limited, leaving aside the question of self-pardoning. I think it would be very hard to say that there aren't a lot of people that he could pardon if he wants to. He cannot, however, pardon for state crimes, and that is a potentially significant limit given some of what is pending possibly in New York. And then there's the question of self-pardoning, and maybe we'll discover that, maybe not. Nobody knows. So far, the limits on the pardon power, it's really a prerogative of the president.
So as you suggest, Professor Metzger, we are facing a lot of new questions in addition to old and familiar questions. And one of the things I think we'll all be looking at in the coming days, weeks, months, years is what happens, right? What happens when new questions are asked, or questions are asked in a way that they haven't been asked before. So let me wrap up with an old question, but a very important one for the students in our audience, and really for anybody in our audience. We know that a lot of members of the Columbia community and others watching this have gotten more engaged in this election cycle than they ever have before. And I'd like to close out with, if each of you could just offer a tip for how people might find ways to stay involved. And so Dean Coll, let me go ahead and we'll go back to you, and we'll go in the same order as we started.
Well, I'm afraid I may be the least qualified person to answer that question, because my answer is always journalism. But I do think that being a witness to these events, it's certainly been a time of very high engagement for our students, and the level of interest and criticism about media always rises during an intense election cycle. It's I think a time where I guess I would say many journalisms are emerging from the legacy and kind of orthodox journalism that maybe Shailagh and I grew up in. And that's an opportunity for young people to define their roles as reporters and writers and witnesses, because I think we're moving into a much more plural space for that kind of engagement with politics. I do find it extremely rewarding, because leaves you independent, and it's quite joyous to travel around and ask impertinent questions of powerful people, which is one of the things we get to do.
Yes, and one of the things that all of our students should be doing on a regular basis, in whatever the disciplines are that they're studying. Professor Metzger, over to you.
Well, I'm also, it's not necessarily my expertise either. I have to say I'm really inspired by what Stacey Abrams has been able to do in Georgia. And looking across the map, I think that really shows that getting out there and organizing and getting, working with those kinds of groups can really have an impact. So I would take heed from that for those who want to stay involved.
And that group is called, her main group in Georgia is called Fair Fight. Is that right?
Mhm.
Great. Professor Greene.
I'll say two things very briefly. One is just to echo what Professor Metzger just said, and to resist the lure of national politics. That there's a lot that one can do at the state and local level, and that's true even in a state like New York, where at the national political level it's quite blue and quite democratic, but there are all kinds of issues and problems, including in conducting free and fair elections. That are problems at the local level in New York City. The second thing is reflects what you said earlier, Professor Goldberg, that we're in a space where you can where those micro communities and polarized sorted communities are forced to engage with each other in various ways. And so I would just encourage students to take advantage of your time here and, take someone who disagrees with you to lunch. And it's hard to do that during the pandemic, obviously, but invite them to a Zoom coffee or something. Because, I think part of the problem of polarization is a problem of we're all sitting in our homes too much and in front of screens too much. There are ways of using that space and that technology to reach out to others. And I think the university environment is a perfect way to do that and try to learn to persuade each other of things rather than just shout at each other.
Very important point for all of us, students and not, to keep in mind. Actually, Professor Murillo, let me go to you and then we'll end with Shailagh.
Yes, I do agree that I think the energy that was put in this election, both in terms of information and in terms of organizing volunteer, should be ideally divested in local organizations. Not necessarily only political, but based on issues that are of interest to students. I think immigration, climate change, voting, poverty. There's many issues. And I think, it's important to influence the political process, to also push from the bottom. And I think we've seen that in both sides of the political arena in this election. So I think it's important that the students do that, and they get the experience of having affected our results. And I do agree with Jamal that it's very, very important, and I would say difficult, however, at the university to find people that you disagree with. And so looking for people who are different from you, we're all sorted. It's not so easy, but getting to the other community, sitting with someone that doesn't look like you, not only that thinks differently, I think it's important trying to understand how others think. Even if you tremendously disagree, for your own sake, it's very important to try to understand the logic in which the other people think and to respect their way of thinking, even if you disagree with their ideas.
Thanks so much. And I can't resist putting in a little plug for University Life events, because they are a place to get to know people who are like you and also very different from you, to talk about serious issues and to have some fun. And these are both great ways to start to engage across differences. So Shailagh, you've been in and around politics a long time. What advice do you have for students of any political viewpoint, or students who are still forming them, and others?
Okay, this is probably going to really annoy you, Suzanne, but I spent my college years like working in a nightclub and at a record store, and I feel like I learned more about people and the way they see things by just living in the world as opposed to living within like a political conversation that seems to be like, I mean, I think we've reached a phase of information overload that has like created almost a pathology, and people have confused like data and information and analysis with actual like understanding, and the, you know, cave like reality that we all live in right now only reinforces that, right? But really the answers are out there, and you know, having a conversation with someone you don't agree with is often about not talking about those things you don't about the things you don't agree on, but actually on all of, like, you know, your kids you know, hockey game or whatever. Or sitting, I mean, it's, the ironic thing is Washington, for all it's disparaged and misunderstood in so many ways, we actually in Washington live around each other. We all have friends who we don't agree with, you know, we have you know, my daughters went to a high school where Brett Kavanaugh's daughter goes to school, and you know, it's like you just like have to deal with these things, and it's actually that's where, I mean, the people in politics who really succeed and get it and transcend the sort of bleacher version of politics are the people who are building off their own life experiences, and whether that's you know, being a community organizer, as Barack Obama was, or being a, you know, billionaire, you know, fantasist, like reality star, like Donald Trump was. I mean, these are people are like, they're organic people whose politics reflect their own personal experiences and their view of the world that's forged by those personal experiences. So have those personal experiences, right? And get out in the world and get involved and do things at a, not just a local level, like in a political sense, but live in the world and develop passions and deep interests. And that's what fuels like a healthy, successful democracy. And those are the voters, you know, who the thoughtful people who kind of support us through thick and thin, right? Who always kind of help the country get through these periods. And we just, we need more of those folks, frankly, the ones who you're not quite sure what they're going to do on election day, but who you have to get out and work for. So that's, you know, stay after this particular session is over. Anyway.
So Shailagh, I you know what, I'm actually maybe surprise you, like going to endorse the idea of getting out and about. And part of what I want to endorse is that there are a lot of ways to do that, even within Columbia. Yeah. And there's actually a great diversity of views in the student body, across the faculty and the staff. And so wherever you are situated in the country, in the world, there's a lot of ways to start strengthening those connections. And I think what you're hearing from everybody is that that is on all of us. And that is a key way in which all of us can play a role in not only imagining, but actually creating and strengthening what happens politically in this country over the next 4 years and to come. So with that, I want to thank all of you who have attended. I want to encourage everybody who's watching to take a look at CU Engage on the University Life website, to look out for some more things to do and learn and be. And I really would like to invite everybody to join me, and I hope panelists who hear this resounding applause, to thank all of our panelists today for a really fantastic conversation. Thank you so much, and we will see you soon.